St. Louis, Missouri, a Saturday afternoon in June 1937, 20 minutes before 2. Roy Baxter, 32, a warehouse clerk, stood with his wife Helen and their 2 children, Sam and Ruth, in a crowd pressing toward the levee at the foot of Washington Street, waiting for the gangway of the steamer President to open. The President rose above the crowd like nothing else on the riverfront. 5 decks of steel, only 3 years out of her rebuild, certified to carry 3,100 passengers in a single run. Her hull built originally as a Cincinnati packet, before Streckfus Steamers had bought her, stripped her, and made her the largest excursion boat most of the people on that levee had ever stood beside. Roy had not chosen the boat for its size. He had chosen the 2 o'clock afternoon excursion, specifically over the 8:30 moonlight cruise that would leave the same levee later that evening. And he had never once explained to Sam why the afternoon crossing mattered more than the one with the full dance band and the colored lights on the water. Sam, 8, already knew where he wanted to stand once the gangway crowd loosened onto the open deck, the rail on the downstream side, the spot his father always let him claim first, close enough to hear the paddle wheel churn once the boat backed off the levee. Ruth, 6, held her mother's hand and watched a line of boys near the ticket booth listening for the calliope, which had not started yet, the way a crowd listens for something it already knows is coming. Roy checked his pocket watch. 10 minutes. He had told Helen, the first summer they'd brought the children, that the afternoon boat was simply more practical. Home before dark, no need to arrange for anyone to mind Sam and Ruth past their bedtime. He had never told her, because he had never entirely said it to himself, that the afternoon crossing was also the one where a father could stand at the rail with his children without competing with a dance floor built for other people's evening, and that some part of what he wanted from this Saturday had nothing to do with practicality at all. What had Roy Baxter built, without ever naming it, into his choice of the 2 o'clock boat over the moonlight cruise? And what did a father want 2 hours on the President's open deck to give his children that the levee crowd, the calliope, and the size of the boat itself could not give them on their own? What the Baxters boarded that afternoon was not simply a boat. The President had been built specifically to be the largest and most modern excursion vessel on the Mississippi, a steel hull, originally built in 1924 for the Cincinnati packet trade, purchased by Streckfus Steamers in 1933, and rebuilt at the St. Louis levee while curious citizens watched the work take shape. She made her trial run on July 1, 1934, with more than 1,000 dignitaries aboard, under Captain John Streckfus himself, and entered public excursion service 3 days later. 5 decks, 291 feet stem to stern, certified for 3,100 passengers, air-conditioned, with rainbow shadow box lighting rigged into the main salon and the ladies' powder rooms, refinements the company's own advertising called the epitome of modernity, and which, on a St. Louis riverfront that had known excursion boats since the previous century, they genuinely were. None of the President's cabin space was built for sleeping. Like every Streckfus excursion boat since the original JS in 1901, the deck space that a packet boat would have devoted to staterooms went instead to a dance floor and bandstand, because Streckfus Steamers had built its entire business on a single, explicit operating principle. Passengers were meant to dance, and if they weren't dancing, they got bored, and bored passengers did not come back the following Saturday. A full-season house band played aboard the President from her first summer, led by bandleaders Marable and Charlie Creath, men whose names meant something specific to St. Louis families who came back year after year for exactly that reason. Roy Baxter had never once bought a ticket to the moonlight cruise. He kept his family on the 2 o'clock boat, at the rail, with Ruth's hand in her mother's, and Sam planted at the downstream rail. And this, too, was a choice, repeated every summer, that he had never explained. The dance floor was for the evening crowd, for courting couples and the young men from the rail yard who came aboard specifically for Creath's band. Roy wanted his children at the rail in the afternoon sun, close enough to the paddle wheel to feel the boat's power, rather than watch a band play it out on a maple floor. What did a boat built this specifically, dance floor, calliope, 3,100 passenger capacity, no staterooms at all, actually require of the Baxters in exchange for their Saturday? And what did their particular choice, the afternoon rail over the evening floor, tell us about what they had truly come aboard the President to get? Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the American excursion boat trip between 1900 and 1980, what the steamer or the dayliner or the coastal tour boat actually offered, what the crew and the regular passengers built into the trip over years of repetition, and what families were actually getting from 2 hours on the water that the destination on either end could not give them alone. Not nostalgia for an old photograph of a steamer. The documented social meaning of a trip that a generation of American families built into their summers on purpose. Even if you never boarded a Mississippi excursion steamer, what it gave a family, an afternoon built entirely around the sound of a calliope and the width of an open river, is something almost no modern trip is built to offer. And if your family took a river excursion like this, put it in the comments. Did your family ever take a boat like the Streckfus Steamers? And do you remember the calliope, or which rail was always yours? Next time on this channel, the coastal tour boats of Cape Cod that carried New England vacationers out to sea for a single unhurried afternoon. Back to the rail. By 2:30, the President had backed off the levee and swung her bow downstream, and the calliope Sam had been listening for finally started. A bright, brassy, unmistakable sound that Roy Baxter had grown up hearing from blocks away, the same way a whole generation of Mississippi River towns had learned to recognize it. Streckfus Steamers had installed its first calliope on the city of Winona around 1900, not as entertainment exactly, but as an advertisement. The sound carried for miles along the water, and people gathered at landings up and down the river, specifically because they'd heard it coming, and some of them bought tickets on the spot. By 1937, the calliope was no longer a novelty. It was simply what a Streckfus boat sounded like, the specific noise that told a St. Louis neighborhood the President was backing off the levee, whether or not anyone in that neighborhood had a ticket that day. Sam had heard the calliope from the rail every summer of his life without ever being told what it meant, in the same way he had never been told to associate the sound specifically with his father's hand steadying him at the rail. Ruth, still new enough to the trip to find the sound startling, buried her face briefly against her mother's skirt before deciding, the way 6-year-olds decide things, that she liked it after all. Helen pointed out the Eads Bridge as the President passed beneath it, its iron arches strung with the ordinary Saturday traffic of a city that had, for most of a century, built its downtown facing this river rather than away from it. This was one of the specific things a Mississippi River excursion offered that a shorter trip could not. Not scenery exactly, but a documented sequence of a working city seen from the water it had been built around. Warehouses, grain elevators, the packet wharves still doing freight business alongside the excursion trade. Ordinary St. Louis going about its Saturday from an angle almost none of its residents ever saw, except from the deck of a boat like this one. Roy had made this same kind of trip as a boy, aboard one of the company's older sidewheelers, sometime before the President existed at all. A boat he barely remembered by name, but whose calliope, he was fairly certain, had sounded almost exactly like this one. He remembered almost nothing else specific about that childhood crossing. What he remembered, standing at this rail with Sam beside him nearly 20 years later, was the particular way the calliope's sound seemed to organize an entire crowd's attention at once, turning strangers on a levee into something briefly, specifically unified. What was it about that particular brassy, unmistakable sound, heard by a whole city, not just the passengers who'd paid for it, that fixed itself so precisely into a St. Louis childhood, more permanently than almost anything else about a Saturday on the river? As the president worked her way back upriver toward the levee in the late afternoon, Roy noticed the crowd already gathering on shore for the 8:30 moonlight cruise. Young men from the rail yards in pressed shirts, young women in groups of 2 and 3, couples arriving together with the specific unhurried confidence of people who had somewhere to be later and nowhere to be sooner. This was the crowd the dance floor below decks existed for. Streckfus Steamers had built its entire operating model on Charlie Creath's and Fate Marable's bands, drawing exactly these passengers back, Saturday after Saturday, for a kind of evening no dance hall on land quite replicated. Music carrying across open water in the dark, the lights of the boat reflected on the river. A specific social occasion built entirely around the fact that everyone aboard had chosen, on purpose, to spend the evening somewhere that was neither home nor a fixed destination, but simply moving. Sam watched the evening crowd with the specific curiosity of an 8-year-old noticing, for the first time, that his Saturday and someone else's Saturday could look almost nothing alike while starting from the exact same levee. Roy did not explain the moonlight cruise to him, not because there was nothing to explain, but because he was not yet sure how to say, to a boy this age, that a boat could be the right place for entirely different reasons, depending on who was standing at the rail and what hour it was. Helen had gone on the moonlight cruise exactly once, the summer before she and Roy were married, with a group of girls from her rooming house. She remembered almost nothing about the specific music the band had played that night, and everything about the particular quality of the dark water and the colored lights strung along the upper deck, and the fact that Roy had found her at the rail sometime after 10, and neither of them had said anything worth remembering, because neither of them had needed to. What did the same boat, on the same levee, on the same river, give to an 8-year-old boy at 2 in the afternoon and a courting couple at 8:30 that night? Two entirely different experiences built from the identical vessel, the identical calliope, the identical width of water. And what does that tell us about what a Mississippi excursion boat was actually built to provide? Before you can fully understand why Roy Baxter treated the 2 o'clock excursion as something worth the same careful, repeated choice every summer, you need to understand what a ticket on the president actually meant for a warehouse clerk's household in St. Louis in the middle of the Depression decade. Streckfus Steamers had built its excursion business, from the very beginning, on keeping the base fare within reach of exactly this kind of family. A policy the company had followed since John Streckfus first converted the JS in 1901, understanding correctly that a boat this large could not survive on the occasional wealthy passenger alone. It needed the Baxters and hundreds of families like them coming back nearly every Saturday of the season. Roy's wages at the warehouse were not generous, and 1937 was not an easy year to be a St. Louis clerk with 2 children. The hardest years of the Depression were only recently behind the country, and nothing about a warehouse job in that decade felt permanently secure. But the president's afternoon excursion had been priced, deliberately, as an ordinary Saturday rather than a special occasion requiring special saving, the same operating logic that had kept Streckfus boats full through decades when a family's entertainment budget was measured in dimes rather than dollars. Roy did not think of the ticket as an indulgence. He thought of it, the way his own father likely had, as simply what a St. Louis summer Saturday was for. The crew who ran the president understood the shape of this loyalty from the inside in a way the Baxters standing at the rail never fully saw. Deckhands, ticket takers, and the boat's officers worked a season built entirely around exactly this kind of returning local crowd. Families who came back Saturday after Saturday, couples who specifically waited for the moonlight cruise. Regulars the crew began to recognize without needing introductions. Captain John Streckfus had built his entire company on understanding this crowd better than any competing excursion line on the river, and by 1937, that understanding had produced, in the President, the largest and most carefully calibrated excursion boat the Mississippi had ever carried. What did it mean for the Baxters and for the hundreds of St. Louis families like them that a boat this large, this expensive to build and run, had been priced specifically so that an ordinary warehouse clerk's Saturday could include it without a second thought? Before you can understand exactly why the calliope mattered as much as it did, you need to understand what competition among Mississippi River excursion companies had built into that specific sound. Streckfus Steamers was not, in the boat's earliest decades, the only excursion operator plying the river between New Orleans and the Twin Cities, and the company's decision to install a calliope on the city of Winona around 1900 was never simply decorative. It was a direct answer to a competitive problem. A steamboat approaching a landing was, in the years before radio advertising reached deep into small river towns, essentially invisible to potential passengers until it was already close enough to see. The calliope solved that problem specifically. Its sound traveled for miles ahead of the boat itself, meaning a Streckfus vessel could announce its own arrival and its rival's absence before a single passenger had glimpsed the smokestacks. None of this history was visible to Sam or Ruth at the rail. It was visible to men like Captain John Streckfus and, later, his sons Joseph, Vernon, Roy, and John Jr., who had built an entire family business on precisely this kind of competitive advantage, understanding, decades before most American industries used the word, that the specific experience aboard a boat and the specific way that boat announced itself to a town were both, equally, part of the product. The band leaders the company hired, men like Marable and Charlie Creath, were themselves a competitive answer to rival lines. Streckfus understood that a truly excellent dance band, paid a standard season wage and quartered aboard, would draw a loyal local crowd back Saturday after Saturday in a way that a merely adequate one never could. This was the specific, invisible machinery underneath the Baxters' Saturday, a decades-long competition among Mississippi excursion operators that had, indirectly, produced the exact calliope sound Sam had grown up recognizing from blocks away, and the exact quality of music that made the moonlight cruise worth Helen's specific memory from before she was married. What did it mean for the Baxters and for a whole river economy of deckhands, musicians, ticket sellers, and levee vendors that an ordinary family's Saturday afternoon existed in its specific, memorable form only because rival steamboat companies had spent decades competing for exactly this kind of loyalty? The Baxters' 1937 excursion sat near a genuine high point in the Streckfus Company's history. The President was still new, still the largest excursion boat on the river, and the fleet as a whole was thriving, even as the company managed an aging inventory of older wooden-hulled boats alongside her. What Roy could not have known, standing at that rail with Sam beside him, was how quickly the specific conditions that made this Saturday effortless would begin to change. By the late 1930s, the U.S. Coast Guard had tightened safety standards for wooden-hulled riverboats considerably, a shift that pushed the company, which had lost its original flagship, the JS, to a fire in 1910, further toward steel construction, a trend that produced not only the President, but, in 1940, the even larger SS Admiral, built on the steel hull of a 1907 railroad ferry and finished in a streamlined Art Deco style. Mark Twain might have struggled to recognize as a riverboat at all. Then came the war. Gasoline rationing and wartime travel restrictions cut deeply into the fleet's ability to operate, and by 1942, the President stood alone as the only Streckfus boat still running excursions on the upper Mississippi. The rest of the once thriving fleet laid up or reassigned, the crowded Saturday levees of a few years earlier reduced to a single boat carrying whatever local traffic the war years allowed. The company survived the war, as many American excursion lines did, But the documented shift in American entertainment habits that followed it, new competing amusements, changing musical tastes as the big band era gave way to other sounds, and, over the following decades, the same growing convenience of automobile travel that reshaped excursion boat culture across the entire country meant the crowded calliope summoned Saturdays of 1937 would never again be quite what they had been. The SS Admiral ran her final excursion season in 1978, and Streckfus Steamers retired her the following year, closing out, within this channel's own 1900 to 1980 window, very nearly the entire arc of the family business Captain John Streckfus had built from a single converted packet boat in 1901. What does it mean that the specific Saturday Roy Baxter built an entire family ritual around, the calliope, the levee crowd, the 2 o'clock boat chosen deliberately over the moonlight cruise, sat so close to the peak of a company whose entire particular world would be substantially changed within just 5 years, in ways neither Roy nor his children could have anticipated that afternoon? Sam Baxter drove his own children to the St. Louis riverfront for the first time as a destination, rather than a departure point in 1959, the year a new stretch of highway made the drive across the city a matter of minutes rather than a streetcar ride and a walk. He parked within sight of the old levee where the president had once loaded 3,000 passengers on a single Saturday, and he did not, that first afternoon, think particularly hard about the calliope at all. There was no reason to. The highway had made getting anywhere in St. Louis simpler than it had ever been in his father's day, and a boat ticket was no longer the obvious way to spend a summer Saturday among a dozen easier options. What the highway gave Sam Baxter, a trip measured in minutes rather than a whole afternoon built around a fixed departure time, a parking space instead of a levee crowd, an outing that needed no ticket, no calliope, no dance band, and no dependence on a single family company's decision to keep an aging fleet of excursion boats running at all. What it did not give him, a rail his own son could claim before any music started. A sound that could be heard blocks away, and that meant, with total unambiguous clarity, that a Saturday had properly begun. A levee crowd that briefly, specifically, unified strangers around nothing more than the shared anticipation of a boat pulling out. A 2 o'clock choice, deliberately made over a later one, that structured an entire afternoon into something a father could stand inside rather than merely pass through. Sam Baxter did not know, driving into the city in 1959, that this was what his father had been giving him every Saturday of his own childhood. He came to understand it only years later, the first time his own son asked him, entirely reasonably, why they didn't just drive down to the arch and skip the boat talk altogether, and found that his best answer was not really an answer at all, but a specific, still vivid memory of a brassy, unmistakable sound carrying across a crowded levee, and his father's hand steadying him at a rail, while a whole city briefly turned to listen. The rail had known what to do with a boy standing at it for 2 unhurried hours. No one had thought to ask the highway to. If this channel is going to keep documenting what the American excursion boat trip meant to the families who chose it summer after summer, subscribe. There are more steamers, more river crossings, more evening cruises, and more crowded docks that were the best 2 hours of somebody's whole summer and were never described that way at the time because they didn't need to be. Even if you never rode a Mississippi excursion steamer yourself, what it gave a family, an afternoon built entirely around the sound of a calliope and the width of an open river, is something almost no modern trip is built to offer. And if you have a memory of a steamer, a calliope, a rail you claimed every summer, a crossing you still remember in specific physical detail, put it in the comments. Did your family ever take an excursion boat like the Streckfus Steamers, and do you remember which rail was always yours? Next time, the coastal tour boats of Cape Cod that carried New England vacationers out to sea for a single unhurried afternoon.